you for inviting me to share my ideas, or mainly I will be talking a little bit about the work we are developing and have been developing at UBC Okanagan in the context excuse me, I was going to say, and I want to acknowledge that we actually create all this beautiful work in the Seeded Silks territory, and yeah, so I will also discuss some of the background of that inspires this work. We come from the artistic background, extending to the environmental and climate change domain, cultural, and I want to mention that this work is inspired by John Robinson, who was a UBC professor until recently, and he created Center for Directed Research on Sustainability. And he had these wonderful questions that how can human activities lead to improvement of both environmental and human well-being? How can we go beyond not creating damage for the environment, but how can everything we do actually create positive impact? And you may be quite aware of the concept of regenerative sustainability, which comes from the design and architecture and engineering more so, but it's a beautiful concept. And Robinson, in the context of developing the Center for Directed Research on Sustainability, which is regenerative building, or a great attempt to create a building that actually creates positive impact. I'm not really sure. I haven't studied papers recently how successful the building is, but there was lots of ideas like building capturing the heat from the surrounding buildings and the way. So, but I think the notion of the regenerative sustainability is really powerful on many levels. It can really reach out from the design to every human activity. So we live in the industrial age society, and we're trying to move towards the regenerative society. So how do we do that? How do we change our individual behaviors, our culture, and our practices at the same time? How do we shift the entire system? So all of the layers of the society become important. Our energy, the food, the material, the human well-being, all of that. There was lots of discussion of the sustainability being a sense of the worldview. So you see, we have, Robinson talks about that, this notion of sustainability is a sacrifice. So we have to use less, to do things in order to be sustainable. But how can we twist sustainability as positive actions? So everything we do is positive. So one is like partnering with nature and each other for positive impact rather than, of course we need to change the entire way in which we do things. As in nature there is no waste, we produce lots of waste. In nature the waste and the decay becomes the nutrition for regeneration. We, on the other hand, are getting much better at recycling, but still producing lots of waste. So how can we align our ways of being with the living system in order to create more sustainable living? So there's lots of things to consider, as I mentioned earlier, from biophysical aspects to human and social elements. So how can we move towards the regenerative society? happy and fulfilled and healthy. So one of the ways that is recognized that might have impact, which is what my perspective, is the cultural elements. So how can culture help bring us there? So the people create places, and places in turn create cultures, and so how do we create, so to speak, these cultural interventions where the events become spreading around into those regenerative circles. So this is the beauty about cultural approaches, that it becomes, and we've seen Vancouver transforming the last 10 years around this sustainability. Certainly UBC and the Center of Interactive Research on Sustainability is a great inspiration. But here is one of the class projects that I think represents some of these ideas. We got invited from the facilities at UBCO to do something by David Waldron, who is our director of facility space planning. They closed the road. Said, how to activate the road? Well, let's bring artists and students, art students, activate the road, and students decided to turn the road into the river. And we created this large mural last year. So I'm gonna give you a little bit about my personal story. Where did I get these ideas? I actually spent time studying in Bali during my PhD. I was interested. I was actually studying computational arts and technology from a more design side of things, but I found I went to study shadow play in Bali as a kind of model for interactive media performance. I don't know if that makes sense, but it did make sense to me. But what I discovered about interactivity is that really the interactivity is how the work interacts with the community and how the community and the work shape each other. So it's about the process, what Balinese called as sakala patra, space, time, and context. So everything the puppeteer does, it's that for the specific space, context, specific event. So everything is very localized, and then you bring the wisdom into the event. So I really was moved by that. Even though I spent lots of time building puppets and sitting around, I want to say the Balinese teachers were extremely generous. They were but just immersing into the culture. It really shifted my perspective about art making, especially about the technology design. How do we go about create meaningful technologies that actually can make cultural value, provide some value. This image is adopted from Richard Schechner, theater anthropology. So essentially, when we're thinking about the rites of passage in the context of the Balinese shadow theater, which is always usually used for some kind of ritual event. It can be wedding, it can be tooth filing ceremony, or other events. There's this sense of the ritual subject moving from one place to another. Saying wedding is a good example because you get married, the two people come together, they'll never unmarried again. You know, it's a permanent change. So what does society do? Philosophically and pragmatically, how does the whole social context support that permanent transformation? So this graph, which is based on checking, is actually looking at that process. So you have the participant and ritual subject on one side, that is the ordinary me, the ordinary state of being, our everyday, day-to-day. Then we have this threshold, which essentially often uses masks, puppet screens, stories, music, dance, myth, to lead people through that presentation, transformation, in order to enter this free play, a kind of temporary autonomous zone where you can reconstruct your identity and then come back into the normal day-to-day, permanently changed. So there is an interesting relationship between the liminal, so to speak, interface and technological interface. So can those, that window into another world, into the world of the media, use songs and stories in the same ways to help create constructive, positive transformation. So that's the basic idea. So what are the cultural codes and local knowledge that is necessary to create interfaces that actually reinforce the cultural regeneration, so to speak? So in a way, we braid all of these elements, the stories, videos, media, codes, with space-time and context and local, and whatever we're talking about. If we're talking about climate change, the local context, or the context of the event, into creating these experiences that can take many forms. So the question is, sorry for the terminology, here you can replace generative with media art, because it's a lingo for computer-based run works that are database driven or computationally driven. So are there some links between computational media works and the sustainability? But there may be some interesting links, like what's nice about computationally driven works is that it can, if structured appropriately, it can provide common ground. It can work from a big sets of media, of interviews, of community reflections to create a common knowledge that maybe it's hard to understand otherwise. And how can that help with sustainability? We can build cultural narratives that come from the community. So, so arguably, the computational media can help us extend that contextual rationality that Balinese Shadow Master does when he prepares a shadow play. It's all about space-time context, building it from the place up and then back for that place. And why media art in sustainability is because it can provide interactive experience where we can learn through experience. It can visualize concepts and provide storytelling, and also the interactive media, computational interactive, can help us see the world as constructed and as interchangeable. I'll show some computer 3D visualization and game examples where that interactivity can really help see the different possibilities. So, research the subject, co-create with community, build experiences using local, experiential, and holistic approach. So I'm going to show the Future Delta work, which was a collaboration with Stephen Shepard, who is a UBC professor here. And we actually created this. Stephen Shepard is a landscape planner, and he has done extensive research over the years in Delta, municipality of Delta. And my lab at UBCO worked on some of the visualizations of the game and the game design components with Stephen, but the work was based on the long-term research in terms of how can Delta respond to the risks, climate change risk in general, but flooding risks that are more particular. So I'm just going to play the video for a little bit. Is anybody know how much time I didn't check the time. I just don't want to go over that. We went too long.
It was 3:53. Do you need sound?
No, it looks like this is the one I didn't test it. It looks fine. Just this.
Future Delta 2.0 is a game where high school students can imagine, see, and experience alternative futures in their own neighborhoods. It is an opportunity to connect their actions now to consequences far into the future, to see that the future lies in the palms of their hands. Future Delta 2.0 is a community-based serious game project. It explores local climate, energy, and community planning future scenarios through immersive experiences. The game is a highly engaging yet informative virtual environment. It allows learners to interact with complex science and community-based decision-making through aesthetic experiences. The intention is to empower players to visualize and intuitively grasp critical scientific knowledge while enjoying challenges, action, and engagement through individual and group decision-making about energy sources and use, climate adaptation and mitigation, broader sustainable urbanism, and lifestyle choices. What would the neighborhood look like if sea levels rise with climate change and we are not prepared with new adaptive measures? What would it look like if we were prepared?
I'm going to just go fast forward to the learning tools.
The interaction within the game provides an in-game feedback mechanism that allows for player observations, analysis, and critical reflection to be tested and practiced within the virtual environment. This experiential learning cycle enables opportunities for modification of player behavior. Player learns about neighborhood climate change challenges and solutions. The second act takes place beginning in North Delta, where the player learns about neighborhood climate change challenges and solutions. The second act takes place in Tilbury and focuses on challenges and solutions facing industries in Delta and beyond. The final third act is situated in Boundary Bay and Ladner, where the player can explore different possible future responses to flooding in Delta. There are three main learning tools: SEMA Vision, Carbon Vision, and Future Vision. The SEMA Vision tool allows player to identify, categorize, and tag objects that are C, causes, I, impacts, M, mitigation, and A, adaptation. SEMA objects are teachable elements, offering the player the opportunity to learn how to see climate change at the neighborhood scale. In the process of categorizing objects in terms of the contribution to causes, impacts, mitigation, and adaptation, the player is able to analyze the neighborhood environment with a more holistic understanding of climate change. Carbon Vision is a visual tool that allows players to see the amount of carbon emitted in the environment by color-coding carbon-producing objects and buildings. As the player encounters different glowing colored objects, the amount of emissions is measured and relayed to the player. The player is then given the option to swap high carbon producing objects with lower carbon producing objects and see the resulting color change. Future vision presents possible imaginary spaces and allows the player to learn about how different solutions for sea level rise could play out in a specific community. Future vision offers the player the chance to engage with 4 different alternatives to sea level rise in the Delta region. Each future allows the player to assess the trade-offs for each solution and experience future work.
I just wanted to show you the learning tools, the examples. But this was a really interesting collaboration because it was my introduction to climate change communication, and maybe the project that I started as soon as I had my initial encounter with Bali. But some of these learning tools really came from gamifying the work that Stephen Shepard was doing in his workshop settings. So, for example, the first one, which was called Cinema Vision, it is a classic way in which Stephen gets community to see the pictures from the neighborhood and recognize the climate change. And then we brought that into a gaming environment, and I think it worked really well as a learning tool. Now with Derek, we had a really great discussion about future delta and the usability. We completed that project in 2017. We tested it in the classroom, and it's not quite alive and living, but of course we learned a lot from it in doing so. I'm going to go back to this slide, but I want to show you another piece we did, which I think is now a little bit in a different zone. We created this Social Life of Water exhibition for the museum, which was really trying to help public understand where the water comes from in the Okanagan, because there is this notion of the landscape aesthetics that Dr. John Wagner, who was a collaborator on this exhibition, he's an anthropologist, was talking about. And come to Okanagan, it's all green and lush, we have lots of water, and well, the whole real estate. Well, of course, there is not enough water in Okanagan, and it's not really unknown. There's a beautiful glacier lake, but we have only as much water as the rain. And so how do you bring the story of where water comes from? This exhibition was the story of where water comes from. But one of the really nice things that we developed for this work is that we used lots of interviews from Dr. Marla Sand, who did lots of interviews with indigenous knowledge keepers about Shingle Creek, Dr. John Wagner's interviews with water managers. We collected some other interviews. And so we're trying to intersect the knowledge keeper, managers, scientists, children, and bring the kind of broad community together. So we created a program where we tagged each interview for the concept and meaning, and had the program bring those voices together. And what's nice about this particular approach, this is one, maybe this one can make more sense. Now it looks awfully complex and technical, but if we can bring these different voices together, what happens is that the conversation that never actually happened before begin to emerge. The people who maybe not brought together necessarily, you begin to develop the common ground, and I think developing that common ground and understanding that all of us really care about the environment and care about the well-being of the children and the future, and then speaking from these different cultural perspectives, indigenous, non-indigenous, settler, so on, immigrant, how can we speak from the commonplace in terms of reaching out to the future. And this is I think it's a powerful, another thing about voice.
Because there's water animals and like she means like underwater like animals.
My name is Ruby Alexis. I'm from the Okanagan Indian Band at the north end of Okanagan Lake, also known as Head of the Lake. This song was written by myself with the help of Shirley Paul and Mona Williams, also of the Okanagan Indian Band. I'm a beginner speaker, and this song is called Kikini. It's in Kwantin. It's a song about the people called Kokani, but we call them Kikini. It's a little landlocked salmon, and it's just about the child's experience of experiencing the Kikini.
Kikini, kikini, kakini, kikini, 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 kakini. Why can we come here to kikini? Why can we come here to kikini? Why can we come here to kikini? Ataki hoi kikini, ataki hoi kikini, ataki hoi kikini. Microwave kikini, microwave kikini, microwave kikini. Now change kikini, nakspint met llallwygentyn hwn.
The fact that I can hear spring peepers from my house is reassuring to know that there's a wetland that's big enough and functional enough to support spring peepers. That gives me a sense of I don't know what, a sense of confidence, of a sense that we haven't completely wrecked everything here.
That's we start othering water. It took us over 150 years to get back to a pretty healthy state, and we're not even close to being where we were back then. You can only imagine what we can do with some of the destruction of water within this next little while. You know, if it only took us 100 years to damage this whole central Okanagan area. It won't take us much longer to finish it off by destroying the water sources that we have, or forgetting about them. But
so you get a little bit of sense, but the idea is that we had eight speakers, and each person or character would come from a different speaker based on the relationality. But it was like an infinite audio documentary because of the way and the complexity in which the links. But you clearly see the link between the Kokani song and the children talking about these underwater animals and the water manager's perspective on the wetlands versus the indigenous. And thought, so we have preserved something, we destroyed everything. So you begin to build a common ground. But this was really a story about the water. And we, in this case, used these pop-up panels, which are because the infrastructure in Okanagan for most of the small little heritage museum is very simple. So they worked really well because we, this exhibition, as you can see here, the pop-ups, they traveled all around Okanagan for about 2 years. We did this in 2016, 17, and we just closed down the shop recently, so it was very useful. It was for the community. And then we did a bunch of visualizations for the museum context. This was dealing with connectivity. Like this particular piece was about animals' access to the water and the different channel the wildlife may experience in the Okanagan, because all the valley around the Okanagan is quite developed, so very little access to the lake for the wildlife. And this was a part of the larger connectivity project where with Dr. Leopard, another collaborator from our university, did some modeling to sort out most likely places where there could be a corridor for wildlife corridor, and they actually got it accepted by the municipality. So that's a success story again with the Okanagan conservation program. And we've done a bunch of visualizations for them. Like this one is about seeing the kokanee salmon from the perspective. So you become a kokanee salmon going up the stream, Submission Creek, which is quite urban creek, and you encounter all of these challenges, but then you get to go back into the human world and potentially redesign that world. This one was a bee connectivity app where you could learn about all the local plants that local bees support and rebuild your own garden. So it's almost like a garden planning tool. But yeah, so stuff like that. This is a work that students did. They were looking at some of the John Robinson's paper, and they created this game board which talks about 5 different ways of understanding sustainability. So you sit at a table and you put these pieces, and then you get in your window these different sustainability worlds, like sustainable development versus regenerative sustainability. So, okay. More on generative artwork. This is more of the kind of artistic interpretation of the people and community and the Okanagan, and I can play it a little bit to you. It's operated more like an installation, where you, at any point, the program is mixing about 8 layers of portraits and different local landscapes, and creating this ever morphing thing. Yes. So you wouldn't actually, if you saw it in the public context, you wouldn't notice it's moving. It's so slow, but then you turn around and you get an entirely different composition. So, another piece we recently did is we're working on this large project called Waterways, which involves a really interesting team. Dr. Jeanette Armstrong, who is a Canada Research Chair in Traditional Ecological Knowledge at UBC Okanagan. And she's also a poet, a very highly regarded poet who kind of is now more of a scientist, advocating for environment. Leopard, who is a complexity science person who does lots of landscape-based modeling, and John Wagner, and myself and Mike Hulme, who are working with a team to develop a museum exhibition that will talk about past, present, and future of the waters in Okanagan. And in the context of researching for that project. We've done a bunch of artworks, but we're actually preparing a new museum work for the 2021. But the first piece we did was a journey of art, and we're quite inspired by the notion of indigeneity. You think? I also come from Belgrade, from Serbia. I was trying, I think one time I was in this women's circle group, and then I think one of the knowledge keeper asked me, well, you know, where do you come from, or what's your indigeneity? You know? And I was thinking, gosh, how do I get to the root of what the, you know, what being indigenous is in the context of the Europe? And then I got to read this great book, The Great Mother, where they look at all the Neolithic cultures across the world. And we look at this notion of the partnership. Remember on that first slide, we have industrial dominance versus partnership? Well, that book was a great inspiration because according to those early cultures, the partnership cultures, they were maybe female-oriented, but they were really about partnership with nature and community. So lots of these figurines are representing looking out into the nature and aligning with nature. So that's, this figurine is one of those great matters. So I went to Vinča, which is one of the archaeological sites, Neolithic site in Belgrade. And I was totally, it blew my mind to see how much the connection between the people and the nature was so alive and so evident in all of the artifacts, in all of the little figurines, and the relationality. And yeah, that's interesting. So, I'm not really sure how much I'm going to play you out of this piece. Let's see. This was in Kelowna Art Gallery. This is not an art piece, so it's didactic, but we used all the images of images from the local creeks. So the sound is not
part of my education, I hope part of your education was learning what it means to be indigenous.
Learning what it means to be guests, we're all guests. So we use some of the community interviews and reflections, but it's more quite an interpretation. Gallery context, different context. High schools, galleries. Currently we have this piece at the Alternative Center for the Arts in at the Alternative Center for the Arts. It's also showing what the Mission and Mill Creek, which are two main creeks that surround Kelowna, used to look like. It used to be like a big web of things everywhere, water everywhere, the wetlands, the grasslands, and now we have these two creeks, and of course we have this increasing flooding. Apparently, Mill Creek, which is this creek, like lost all of these network of water. It has absolutely no capacity to hold any fast flow of water. So the city of Kelowna is panicking. They just got like $60 million for flood response. And so we're looking at, okay, so if we're going to do the restoration, how can you do the restoration that is in a way indigenizing from bringing some of the local, natural local plants and resilience back into the environment. So, okay, so here you see that's where that image came from, but prettified. One of my teachers in Bali said, with beautiful images and beautiful song, you can hear better. And I think you can hear more difficult things. Because the beauty somehow releases the anxiety that is necessary for creative response. Because we need to be all creative, we need to imagine things together in a positive way, so how do we do that? So this is Mission Creek and Mill Creek, and that's the map of Okanagan of what it used to look like. And right now we're working on doing the pre-contact visualizations. So we have this Google document, we're putting all our research up on the web. And we're working on pre-contact visualizations of Okanagan where we can learn about each individual plant. Where the prototype place, we do have a website prototype on our website, but we're essentially looking at 4 creeks and 4 visualizations. And yeah, that's really interesting to try to imagine of what things may have looked like. Now this image is taken from an aerial from 1938, which actually shows the creeks before they were changed. And so the idea is that if we can visualize what some of these spots look like, and we did lots of archival research, we have all the archival reflections of what Okanagan looked like from the settler perspective. We have some work from the indigenous perspective. If we could imagine what it looked like, we're also doing the visualization of what it is now. And then maybe in the future, we can kind of find some right balance of bringing parts in and kind of seeing this different future possibilities. So, yeah, that's it. Thank you so much.
Since this is a small group, I won't, if you have questions, we'll just ask, I think, Dr. Dulic on your own, so.
All right.
Let you MC your own talk.
You use the pronoun we a lot, and I wasn't sure who were the people. Was it working students, or is it your center, or a team that you have?
It's all very much this, is it all very, I try to kind of hear there's talk about the we, acknowledge at least the faculty collaborators, but this is large student teams and productions work on that. We've worked on these projects, and we have individual project websites where you have the extensive. So, for example, Social Life of Water was a co-partnership with the Okanagan Nation Alliance, Kelowna Museums, and UBC. And at the UBC side, John Wagner, who is an anthropologist, he wrote a book called Social Life of Water. It was edited book about the water, so that's why the title of the exhibition. We developed the visual experiences, and so oftentimes we try to work, our group at the center, work with science-based and other knowledge base, and then create those experiences to actually draw people into getting into the concepts. But the process is also largely driven by student development. Now in these complex projects, it's really hard, students do individual aspects. Maybe there is a designer and the audio editor, and so it's a really large team. It's always all this. Maybe not some of the more art stuff I was showing, but these kind of more complex visualizations, past visualizations of pre-contact Okanagan. It's a really complex thing to imagine because you can't just get the pack of local 3D plants. We need to build everything from scratch. And right now we've been building the plants for like last quite a few months, and it's an overwhelming project. And then once we build the plants, we need to imagine, and students do this, how do we go from the map into experience and really try to, maybe sometimes we do land walks. I was going to say another thing, we're preparing for Waterways, we're bringing exhibition for the museum, Heritage Museum, and we decided to focus on two particular stories. One is the return of the salmon that Okanagan Nation was working on for the last 15 years, which was a success project because Okanagan is largely agricultural and it was largely a wetland, the spongy environment that was slowly turned into agricultural land through channelization and damming. In the process of that change, the salmon was lost. And the success story is that last fall, we recorded soca salmon in the Shingle Creek, which wasn't there for a long time. So it's a real success. I know 15 years seems like a long time, but the fact that salmon is back, that kokanee salmon is back, and I think those are the success stories that are worth, so if there is a team approach and extreme technological and engineering innovation to be able to, they had to actually implement and create to bring the fish back. And the way the fish can bypass the dams and the way the water levels, and it's a strong coordinated partnership approach between indigenous and non-indigenous management in order to bring the fish back. So that's a real good story. That's similar for Lokati lands. Anyway, I'm going off, but yeah. Questions? Yeah.
I have one question. So you presented some wonderful initiatives here, and thank you very much. I was fortunate enough to actually see some of them firsthand. And I was always wondering about whether one can see or measure, if you wish, the effectiveness, the impact of these projects in the community. Ultimately, we know what the goal would be, right? But is there a way, or are you collecting any, again, feedback information about how successful a particular project would be in the community, and bring this information back to your team so that's probably work on?
Thank you, that's a great question. So we did for every project, every visualization, not for the small ones, the little museum tabletop pieces, but for Future Delta there was an extensive evaluation with the students, and we learned a lot from that even before. For social life with water, we did the qualitative, and that's a really good question. It's like, how do you measure that?
Yes.
And we found that we went with influence maybe by more sciencey approach that Stephen is bringing. We did pre and post question here. I haven't found them useful because we didn't ask the right questions. It's like, you go back and you say, well, no, I'm interested in this, but it wasn't captured. So you really need to be, in terms of the Future Delta evaluation, the video that was randomly positioned was the most useful. Because then you can go back to the video and say, no, I'm actually interested about this, and why students didn't finish in time, and did they see this? So video was extremely useful in that context. And I'm just saying, some of the questionnaire, I guess if you are really good at measuring that, yeah, I guess it's, but you have to be a game researcher, the educational game research, it's like very specific. It's the first project we've done that, so getting the right questionnaire. So not to say that it's not possible, I just personally didn't find that useful. But from that experience, we used, for social life of water, we used the process called visual matrix, which essentially was an evaluation method created in UK by museum experts to measure the sensual experiences. And what it is, and that one, I think it worked extremely well. Now, it doesn't give you the museum would have data, how many people saw things and so on. It gives you a very different kind of information. As a matter of fact, people the focus groups who engaged in evaluation understood the exhibition infinitely better. So it's like totally biased because they went through this kind of collaborative brainstorming process where you bring 15 people together into the same experience going through the exhibition. Then they sit down and the facilitator asks, there's no conversation, but you're asked, you bring the image and people respond with images. And in that context, people cried because they start thinking about their place and just the concepts and the ideas. So we really captured. But again, also the people who were part of the focus group arguably got much more out of the exhibition. Students who worked on it learned way more about the environment and the local places they are. So, but you could definitely understand the value of bringing those ideas into the public. I guess that is measured with those, but it's qualitative. Even though maybe we had measured 60 people, and each time each group had its own, we got some pretty fascinating, strong responses. So, it's nice that people are moved. But yeah, big question. Thank you. Thank you, guys.